Hello, everybody. This is Awdry Studios, and welcome to Thomas and Tugs. Are they in the same universe? Well, that's the question. And I could give you my verdict now, but what good will that do us? No doubt some of you will point out how I am wrong, and thus I should have chosen the alternative. So before I tell you my answer, I'm going to show you why I chose that answer by comparing Tugs with the classic era, i.e. series 1 through 7 of Thomas and Friends. If Tugs works with the classic era, then in theory it should also work with series 8 through 24, as they are technically extensions of the classic era, despite pretty much all of the continuity errors, but we'll over that for the time being. Now, I won't be comparing Tugs directly to the Railway series, as far as I can work out, there is no reason to do so, as there are no evidence of any crossovers between them, bar some similar character ideas. But they may or may not, the Railway series may or may not pop up at some point throughout this video. And with that out of the way, it is time to begin our journey. So, all aboard, sit back, and enjoy the ride. So, let's get started with the intros.
The tugboat, for its size, is the most powerful craft afloat. And the Star Tugs are the power behind the docks and waterways that make up the big city port. This is Tugs.
Well, despite the two shows being similar in so many ways, it's intriguing that the intro sequences are so vastly different. The intro for Thomas and Friends only shows Thomas and his coaches running along his branch line on one sunny day. The intro for Tugs, on the other hand, shows much more members of the cast bar the main character, and in a variety of different locations at different times of day and even different times of year. Also, Tugs has a narrated intro that led into an instrumental, whilst Thomas and Friends is just an instrumental. Although Series 8 through 12 did have a narrated intro, sort of, and then the CGI era used the song instead. Now, of course, there is a reason why the intros are so different, and that, of course, is the show's titles. In Thomas, you knew exactly what the show was about from the original title, Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends. Thomas being the name of the main character, the tank engine letting you know the show was about talking trains, and of course the final bit, and Friends, let you know that Thomas isn't the only focus and that other characters will have important roles too. The title does all the work, so not much effort needs to be put into the intro sequence, which may explain why the original intro sequence used from series 1 through 7 was so simple and not very high quality. It didn't need to be. Tugs, meanwhile, doesn't tell you that much about the show, other than it features tugboats. So a huge amount of effort needed to be put into telling you about the show in the intro sequence. You get a good explanation of the show's basic plot in the opening narration, and the various clips used throughout the intro as a whole emphasize this as well. Tugs had a much simpler title, and so he needed to make up for it with a more thought out and complex intro. More importantly, it showed much more of the world that the series took place in, something that Thomas didn't do until Series 8, and didn't really do properly until about Series 17. It's pretty clear that the Thomas characters inspired most of the recurring characters in Tugs, and that some of the Tugs characters inspired later Thomas characters. The similarities between some of them are uncanny. A good example of just how similar these characters are can be found in Stories of Sodor, a series by Victor Tanzig that combines both shows by making stories using the bulk of the Tugs elements, but with Thomas characters. And it works, because of just how similar the characters are. So you should probably go and check that out. I will leave a link to his channel in the description somewhere if you're interested. The point is, though, that all the characters are incredibly similar. In fact, the characters in both shows are so similar, Britt Allcroft, the creator of Thomas and Friends, tried to sue the creator of Tugs over it. Now, I don't know too much about Allcroft's lawsuit, but I do know that she lost, and that she had to pay damages too. The main argument was that Tugs used vehicles with faces. However, Thomas and Friends' copyright was for flattish, grey faces with round eyes. The Tugs' faces were curved, flesh-toned and had squarer eyes, and so all cross-arguments were deemed insufficient. As for the characters themselves, let's take a look at just how similar they really are. We'll start with Thomas and 10 Cents. Both of them are the main character of their respective shows, despite their shows technically being considered ensembles. They are the character that appears in the logo, they're the character that appears on all of the franchise's merchandise, they are the characters that appear the most often and have the most speaking roles. As characters, they are smaller and less experienced than most of the other characters in their respective series, but they are no less hard-working. They are good friends with the bulk of the cast, despite having a somewhat irritating cheeky streak. Hercules is a lot like Edward. They are rarely seen throughout the series, but when they are, they're usually helping others or sharing their experience and wisdom. They're often viewed as a father figure or older brother type for the younger characters. Henry seems to have inspired the character of Big Mac. These characters are both strong and very hard-working. They are also easily annoyed by other characters being cheeky or troublesome, but they still have a good sense of humour, and they are both more superstitious than the other characters. Although having said that, this is probably one of the weaker similarities. Top Hat appears to be a lot like Gordon. They're both stubborn and can be rather stuck up. They love to do the important jobs, which they usually get, and so that makes them quite boastful. They also hate doing the dirty jobs, such as garbage duty, as they believe things like that are beneath them. As James is, personality-wise, somewhere between Henry and Gordon, pompous and vain, but has a good sense of humour, doesn't really have a Tugs counterpart. Similarly, the Tugs character Warrior doesn't really have a Railway series or Thomas and Friends counterpart either. He is somewhat of a more unique personality for that show. He is clumsy. Very clumsy. But nonetheless, he is a hard worker. His ideas are probably best described as stupid enough to work, as his stupid ideas actually save the day on more than one occasion.
Anyone any bright ideas? Anybody got a stupid one, then?
I could set fire to my garbage.
What? What for?
Well, make a light for Vienna, wouldn't it?
I think that's a smashing idea.
Although there are plenty of moments similar to Warrior's life throughout the Thomas franchise, there is no character that is even a close match to him. The closest would probably be the Diesel Sydney. However, Warrior is clumsy, Sydney is just forgetful. There is a significant difference between the two.
Sydney, how long have you been up there?
I'll forget.
It's been about 2 years.
Toby the tram engine seems to have been the main inspiration for Awdry the paddle steamer. They are both old, wise, but in a very different way to characters like Edward or Hercules, and, as far as we know, the last of their kind still in service, steam tram and steam paddle tug respectively. Toby and Awdry are both a bit like an old grandpa. They have a wise old man persona about them, but combined with a family man's friendly nature and a good sense of humour too. Zoran is nearly an exact copy of Diesel. They are basically the leader of the opposition. They are oily, sneaky, and always coming up with devious schemes to get ahead of the competition, almost all of which backfire in tremendous fashion. Zack is Zoran's second in command, but since Diesel usually acts out his schemes alone, Zack hasn't really got a Thomas and Friends counterpart. Zebedee has no Thomas and Friends counterpart in the classic era either, but it's possible that his personality was used as the basis for Paxton from the CGI era. Both of these characters, despite being one of the opposition, have no real allegiance to either side and will help anyone in need regardless of who they are, whether they are Steam or Diesel, a Star or a Z-Stack. Bill and Ben's personalities seem to have been split 3 ways. They almost always work together and often scheme together, but anyone they wrong usually gets their own back, just like the 2 Zero switchers, Zip and Zug. Personally, I find Bill and Ben and Zip and Zug to be hilarious. Why? Well, I think Count Dooku said it best when he describes them as
Devious and deceitful, and most importantly, stupid.
But one could also argue that Bill and Ben may have been the inspiration for the character Billy Shoepack. Both his characters are built a lot lower than the other characters in their respective series. Not that you would know that from their inaccurate models. And they seem to enjoy chaos more than actually doing their work. Of course, you could also argue that Zip and Zug may have also been the inspiration for Ari and Bert, the devious Diesel twins from the Ironworks, who, like Zip and Zug, usually work together and are often scheming ways to outdo the competition. Again, usually backfiring in spectacular fashion. Now, this may be a bit more of a stretch, but the naval tug Bluenose is loosely similar to Spencer. They are both characters that have come from elsewhere, but they believe that they know everything and that they are always right, and so they act accordingly. They also demand a level of respect that they don't deserve and usually pay the price for it. Salty the Dockside Diesel's personality would appear to have come from the character Scuttlebutt Pete, someone who loves to tell old sea tales. In fact, they've told so many sea tales so often that they've begun to believe some of the stories themselves.
Luckily, no one was hurt. Except my ears, wailed Cranky.
It's quite possible that Bertie the Bus was the inspiration behind Puffer, as both of his characters are a different method of transport from the main cast of characters, but are good friends with them regardless, and are always happy to help out where they can. Captain Star is pretty much Tugs' Fat Controller character. They're the man in charge, stern, firm but fair, and clearly has a soft spot for every member of their fleet, quirks, failings and all. Captain Zero, on the other hand, is a little different, as he doesn't really have a counterpart. He is Captain Star's main rival, but is a lot more devious. One could argue he's a bit like the directors of British Railways, but I'm not so sure. I'll leave that decision up to you. There are a few differences between the settings of the two shows, but that's most likely because Tugs only had one series that is set during the Roaring Twenties, and although not confirmed, most likely to be summer of 1921 through to early spring in 1922. Thomas, on the other hand, ranges from 1922 to the present day. The classic era specifically covers 1922 through to the late 60s or early 70s. Probably. It is a little hard to tell when many of the episodes based off of the Railway series were made and aired out of order. For example, the episode Percy Takes the Plunge aired as part of Series 2, an entire series before the episode Percy's Promise in Series 3, despite the episode Percy Takes a Plunge referencing Percy's Promise.
Percy was talking to some engines. He was telling them about the time he had braved bad weather to help Thomas. It was raining hard. Water swirled under my boiler. I couldn't see where I was going.
It is a little confusing at times, let's be honest. The other main difference is because Thomas and Friends is about trains, it is set on a railway, whilst Tugs is about ships, specifically tugboats, so it is set in a large harbour. However, in both shows you can clearly see how trains and ships are two different links in the same chain. They both carry out vital roles for the industries they serve, and are sometimes even friends. Personally, watching Tugs gave me a whole new perspective on the classic era of Thomas and Friends. Characters, settings, the lot. Especially the dockyard scenes in seasons 3 to 5. Perhaps the most important difference, though, is that Thomas and Friends is set on Sodor, a fictional island between England and the Isle of Man, making Sodor a part of the UK, and of course is based off of various locations around the UK. Tugs, meanwhile, is set in Big City, a fictional harbour on America's east coast, and based off the harbours of San Francisco in California and New York City. Despite being set on opposite sides of the Atlantic Ocean, however, there are still some similarities. In particular, harbours and railways are a key element of both shows and appear on a regular basis. And of course, both shows have the characters serving very similar industries, including stone, coal, steel, timber, and even garbage. Despite the settings of these two shows being so vastly different, they're not as different as you would initially believe. There seems to be little to no similarity between the stories of Thomas and Friends and the stories of Tugs. This is most likely due to the fact that the two shows were aimed at two different age ranges. Thomas has always been aimed at younger children, whilst Tugs appears to have been aimed at the next age group up, which I believe is preteens. However, there is one similarity in the stories in both series, and that is the element of realism. Tugs, and at least the classic era of Thomas, stuck very closely to real-life events, real-life working practices, and even real-life superstitions. When writing the Railway series, where possible, the Awdry family based their stories off of real-world events. In fact, some of these stories were carbon copies of real-life events, such as the crash in Percy's Predicament, which was inspired by a real-life incident at Swanley Junction back in 1870. When Thomas came to TV, the series creator, Britt Allcroft, continued to create stories based off of real-life events, at least to begin with. Now it is arguably the most unrealistic children's show going, but that's besides the point. At the time, realism was still very important. For example, the crash in the episode A Better View for Gordon was based off a real-life crash that happened in Paris, in France, back in 1895. The characters themselves were also based off of real-life vehicles. For example, Thomas is based off of a London, Brighton and South Coast Railway E2 tank engine. Diesel is based off of a British Railways Class 08 diesel shunter. Toby is based off of a London North Eastern Railway J70 steam tram, and so on and so forth. Tugs, meanwhile, wasn't based on any real-life events in particular, but it was written with real-life maritime operations in mind, and was heavily inspired by the real-life working practices of the Crowley Fleet from San Francisco and the Moran Fleet from New York, except in the episode Ghosts. But then again, Thomas and Friends ghost story episodes weren't terribly realistic either. But then again, that's ghosts for you, they're not supposed to be. Regardless, Tugs was believable. The works that Tugs did, the way the characters interacted with each other, and to some extent, even the similarity between the rivalry between the two tugboat fleets and any other business rivalry. All of them at least partially based off of real-life working practices. As such, the stories in Tugs are as believable as those from Thomas, which themselves are as believable as possible for a show about talking trains, boats, and other vehicles anyway.
Help! Cried Percy. Murdoch has got my magic carpet! There's no such thing as a magic carpet!
And just like in Thomas and Friends, the characters from Tugs are also based off of real-life vehicles. The paddle steamer OJ is based off of the Eppleton Hall, the last surviving time paddle steam tug, currently based in San Francisco at the Maritime Museum there. Grampus is based off of a two-man midget submarine, which was also called Grampus. Hercules is based off of a real-life tugboat, unsurprisingly also called Hercules, and so on. The liveries that the tugs wore throughout the series were also based off of real life. The Starfleet having the yellow body with red stacks like the Crowley Fleet from San Francisco, and the Zero Fleet having the dark red body with black stacks like the Moran Fleet from New York. So again, massively different between the two, but despite that, the key element for both these shows was the same, to keep it as realistic as possible. So it's pretty obvious that there are a fair number of similarities between the two shows. But why are they so similar? Well, to do that, we need to look at the production history of these shows and some other behind-the-scenes information. The Railway series was created by Reverend Wilbert Awdry back in 1942 as a series of stories that he told his son Christopher whilst he was bedridden with measles. Starting in 1945 and following his wife's suggestion, Wilbert Awdry began publishing his stories in a series of books known as the Railway series. After not one but two failed attempts to bring the Railway series to television, it was finally adapted for TV as the show Thomas and Friends by Britt Allcroft in 1984. Tugs, meanwhile, went straight to TV in 1989 and was created by Robert Cardona and David Mitten. Do those names sound familiar to you? Well, they should, as Cardona and Mitten worked on the first two series of Thomas and Friends as producer and director respectively, and they continued these roles when they moved to Tugs. After Series 2 of Thomas and Friends was completed, Allcroft made plans to sell Thomas in America. Cardona and Mitten, meanwhile, felt that their creative freedom was being crippled by Allcroft's leadership, so they left to create their own show where they had full creative control, and they took several of the show's crew members with them, this including Mike O'Donnell and Junior Campbell, who did all the music for Tugs and the classic era of Thomas. In fact, as far as I can work out, the only person who didn't migrate from Britt Allcroft's team to Tugs was Britt Allcroft herself. Cardona and Mitten even took some of the props from Thomas and Friends to be used on Tugs, most notably the Marklin engine, which after a few American modifications became the tank engine Puffer. Whilst work on Tugs got underway, Allcroft was able to sell Thomas to the American market, with episodes from Series 1 first airing in 1989 as part of Shining Time Station. Tugs meanwhile failed to get an American investor before TVS, the company that aired Tugs on TV and the show's main source of income, went bankrupt. So Mitten and many members of the film crew migrated back to Thomas, bringing many of the Tugs props such as Big Mickey and the Fulton Ferry along with them, while other members of the crew went on to other projects. Cardona in particular moved back to America, and then moved to Canada to work on another show about talking tugboats called Theodore Tugboat. Now whilst they were working on Tugs, Cardona, Mitten and their film crew learnt many new techniques in order to create the show the way they wanted it. This included a greater variety of camera angles, lighting, weather and various types of accidents, as well as improved model making and filming techniques. Mitten and his crew brought many of these new techniques that they'd learned back to Thomas when they began filming Series 3. As a result, there is a noticeable shift in quality between Series 2 and 3. This of course includes better lighting, better camera angles, better weather, more elaborate accidents, a lot more pyrotechnics, more working water sets, and so on and so forth. Before I give you my conclusion, I'm first going to talk about a few more pieces of evidence that didn't really fit into any of the categories I've discussed so far, but I thought were worth mentioning anyway. One of the more commonly used pieces of evidence that suggests Thomas and Tugs are in the same universe is that the various ocean liners and tramp steamers that can be seen coming in and out of Big City Harbour in Tugs also come in and out of Sodor's main harbour in the TV series, which of course is Rendam Docks. Other evidence includes the fact that they both have similar annual events such as a regatta, and that both Big City and Sodor have the same type of fishing boats and ferries and other vehicles, which is because they used exactly the same models. As for evidence against the two shows being in the same universe, one thing you will notice in Tugs is that, with a couple of exceptions, the tugboats are the only characters with faces. Humans such as Captain Star and Captain Zero are never actually seen in person. All we see is a megaphone hanging out of their window. And as for most of the other vehicles and machines that appear in the series, again, no faces, just a megaphone hanging out of a window. Which begs the question, are the characters like Puffer, Big Mickey and Scuttlebutt Pete sentient machines, or people using megaphones? Either way, neither Puffer or the other little steam engine, known as Little Owl, have faces, and Little Owl at least would appear to be non-sentient, suggesting that they can't possibly be in the same universe as Thomas and Friends. As one thing you do notice from Thomas and Friends is that Sir Topham Hatt's car is one of, if not the only, non-sentient vehicle in the entire show. Just who gets to decide which vehicles are sentient and which aren't? It can get so confusing sometimes. So, the main reason that these two shows were at one point so similar is most likely because they were created by the same people in a near identical style using similar filming techniques and similar music styles in the same studio at round about the same sort of time. And this does make me wonder, what would Thomas look like if Cardona and Mitten had full creative control over it? And more importantly, what if Allcroft, Cardona and Mitten merged Thomas and Tugs into one show? We do know that this was Cardona and Mitten's plan as early as Series 1, before Tugs was even a thing. And even though this never happened, Mitten did make one last-ditch attempt during production of the movie Thomas and the Magic Railroad. There is a deleted scene mentioned in one of the original scripts that showed Thomas running past the docks, which would have the Tugs characters in it. However, this scene was later scrapped. Why exactly? Well, I'm not entirely sure. Best guess? Allcroft said yes to the scene at the start to keep Mitten happy, but then pulled the scene later because she just hated Tugs that badly. I don't know if that's the reason why, that's just a theory, but I can't think of a better explanation. Regardless though, it does beg the question. Why? Why weren't the shows combined? Sure, there are some differences between them that would make such a thing nearly impossible. But at the same time, the similarities between them both are absolutely astounding. And if Tugs didn't have to make certain changes to avoid lawsuits from Britt Allcroft, and that Britt Allcroft wasn't the person suing Tugs, then there is a good chance that two shows may have been merged. And this of course brings us back to the question, are Thomas and Friends and Tugs in the same universe? I'm sure if you asked any member of the Thomas and Friends production crew, or the Tugs production crew for that matter, that they would say no. Any similarities between them are purely coincidental. But personally, I'd have to say yes. Tugs is in the same universe as Thomas. And at the risk of causing the Reverend Wilbert Awdry to turn in his grave, I'd say Tugs would also have to be in the same universe as the Railway series, for one simple reason: the show's production history. As we know, the TV show Thomas and Friends exists in the TV series universe as a factual documentary. It also exists in the Railway series, again, as a factual documentary. Because of this, the production history of the show is also present in both of these universes. And once you follow the production histories of the show, that means that by default, the Tugs must also be present in both universes. In the TV series universe, the classic era of the TV series is a factual documentary based on the early events in that universe. This means that in the TV series universe, Allcroft, Mitten and Cardona's expertise would have been in filming a factual documentary, not fiction. Keeping this in mind, and by following the show's production history, Tugs would also have been a factual documentary based off of events that have occurred in that universe, which means the characters and the events of Tugs must have existed in the TV series universe, and any differences between the shows can be attributed to Mitten and Cardona trying to avoid a lawsuit. And since the TV series and its production history also exists in the Railway series universe, then by applying the same logic, Tugs must also exist in the Railway series universe. As in the Railway series universe, the TV series would have been a factual documentary. Mitten and Cardona's expertise would have been making a factual documentary, and so Tugs would have been made as a factual documentary. And therefore, Tugs and its events must exist in both the TV series universe and the Railway series universe. I feel that although Thomas and Tugs are two very, very different shows about two very different groups of characters, they are in many ways a lot like Batman and Superman. They may be two very different ideas in two very different parts of the same universe, but they are in the same universe nonetheless. The same goes with Thomas and Tugs, and the fact is, neither show would be here today without the other. Tugs would not exist if it weren't for Thomas, and without everything that the film crew learned making Tugs, Thomas most likely would not have the same level of fame it has today. It probably would have ended after just 4 series rather than 24. Both of these shows relied so heavily on each other, and neither would have worked if it weren't for the other. Neither would have worked were there not such close ties between them, both on and off screen. Well, that's my opinion anyway. but I'm certainly intrigued to hear what you guys might think. Regardless of what I or you may think about the show, the fact remains, the two shows will be forever linked. Well, that brings us to the end of our journey today. Be sure to leave your thoughts in the comments below, and I will see you again soon.